welcome to the Musicians Weekly, Volume 22. Today I speak about a very interesting aspect of so-called spiritual music, a historically unique phenomenon. So when we look at what is called so-called spiritual music for so-called spiritual uses, today we have a lot of what we can call kitsch music, a lot of very harmless, absolutely beautiful, and a lot of electronically created and even artificial intelligence created sounds. And not very much of that is really music. There's a lot of sound bathing. And all these things can give a bad impression about what people think is spirituality. And it sounds more like a sound bath, something for your comfort, for your pleasant feelings, and something tearing away from reality, from the real world. But what was the original intent of some of the real spiritual masters we know more about that created music, and what did they want? And so there's a very interesting phenomenon about 4 composers born in the 1860s. And they were not all composers. They were composers or people with ideas about composition and inspiring composers. But there is one thing in common for all of these 4, and that is also unique. It is the time when classical ballet was in a kind of decline. It could not go on with so-called early modern music. And so there was the so-called expressive dance of the time. And so new dance forms were something people were searching for, and something where people would express the new feeling of life. And at the same time, new philosophies about spirituality, new ideas were also there. And all these things happened at the time when this kind of international aggression grew and grew, and World War I was on the doorstep. And so people understood that we need new impulses, because what the Christian church and what the traditional religions had done, it could not prevent us from going into disaster. So new things that came were, for example, the so-called anthroposophy of Rudolf Steiner, Austrian-born, who resided in Switzerland, in Dornach near Basel. The so-called white brothership of Petr Danov, Bulgarian spiritual master. What is the real name for this? The groups of Georgy Ivanovich Gurdjieff, and some of his pupils then also, like Pyotr Demyanovich Uspensky or John Godolphin Bennett. So the Gurdjieff groups, who came from Russia and via Caucasus fled the Russian Revolution, via Constantinople went to the West, and finally arrived in France. And there was Monsieur Emil Shakhtar-Gross from Switzerland, a professionally trained composer who became a kind of new guru of rhythmical gymnastics, as he called it, of rhythmical education, of dance education. And all these 4, Shakhtar-Gross was not what we call a spiritual master. He didn't intend that. But all the 3 others had the idea of totally renewing the spirit of the world. So what was in common that all these four developed a new form of movement of dance. They had different names. So Rudolf Steiner called it eurythmy, that means eurythmics. Petar Dönhoff called it pan-eurythmy, pan-eurythmics. Georgy Ivanovich Gurdjieff simply called it movements. And Emil Chekdar-Gross called it rhythmical gymnastics. And they built large schools, and a lot of these things survived in different forms. So the Chekdar-Gross schools are still there today and are for young people who get professionally trained in dancing and in moving around. The Gurdjieff movements survive in particular circles, and the music for the Gurdjieff movements, written by Gurdjieff in collaboration with his pupil Thomas Hartmann, a Ukrainian composer, were a long time only allowed for internal use, and the music was not available for people outside these groups. We have to differentiate between this music for the movements and the other music by Gurdjieff, which was released some years ago in 4 volumes for piano by Schott publishers, also everything in collaboration with Thomas de Hartmann. But these kinds of music are very closely related. Then we have the music by Petar Dönhoff, which were only songs without accompaniment, only just songs, where everybody sang the same song in octaves, women and men, and songs in the style, we could say, in a way of Bulgarian folk music. Some of these songs became now what is considered Bulgarian folk songs. And the music of the Steiner pupils, Steiner himself didn't write music. There is only one small fragment where people think that it might have been written or at least dictated by him. But there were a lot of Steiner pupils in the Goetheanum in Dornach, like Mr. van Stuten and Leopold van der Pals and some others. And there was, today we can speak about a kind of a tradition of anthroposophic composers. And they, of course, also wrote music for the eurythmy purposes. Then we have a next generation. And this is important in the case of Petar Dönhoff, because Petar Dönhoff, he sent his most advanced and most interesting pupil, Omaram Mikhail Ivanov. Later, the name Omaram came later when Mikhail Ivanov had gone to India and had met Babaji and had got his real breakthrough in enlightenment. Omaram Mikhail Ivanov was sent by Petar Dönhoff to France, to the south of France, to the so-called Bonfim. And there he instructed his pupils to arrange all these simple songs by his teacher Dönhoff as 4-part a cappella music. And this music is very, very beautiful. It is, it's very interesting because we have some internationally renowned Bulgarian music for a long time now. Le Mystère des Voix Bulgares, interestingly also a French name. And so we have this kind of typical Slavic and particularly Bulgarian music. And maybe even the most beautiful of these are these 4-part arrangements of the pupils of Ivanov of the songs by Dönhoff. This has nothing to do with the paneurythmics. The paneurythmics is a lighter music they have. But they have particular music also for the paneurythmics, which is very close to folk music also. In the music of the Steiner pupils, we have the music for the so-called mystery plays, which is also more of a solemn kind, and we have the music for arrhythmia, for eurythmics, which is very, very different in the way it has been composed. And the most interesting arrhythmic music any of the Steiner admirers has written ever are the so-called ABC pieces by Martin Scherber. Now, Martin Scherber was an outlaw in anthroposophic circles. He was born in 1907, and so he was a very young man, just growing up when Rudolf Steiner died. And then he heard about Goethe, and when he studied in Munich, and he heard about Steiner, and he became an absolute devotee of all these things he read there. And so then he had a short career as an operetta Kapellmeister in Ostin and Labem, or at that time Aussig, which was still German, is now Czechian, and understood this is not what I want to do for the rest of my life. So he went back to his hometown Nuremberg, and he composed and was a private teacher. And as a private teacher, he was associated, but only freelance, with the Waldorf school in Nuremberg, and he tried to get a foothold there. But it didn't work. He was ignored by the Anthroposophic Society, like we have to say many people who totally had their own way of expressing themselves, and also very often in such smaller circles, we have to say, people who are real genius are a bit pushed aside because they disturb, because this lake is not so big to have these big fishes. And so Scherber became sidelined. And there were people who were very much admirers of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, and they had the idea that we have to write a kind of enlightened spiritual music, but with a closeness to the modernity of Stockhausen in the 1950s, of course. And in these 1950s, Martin Scherber wrote his large Metamorphosic Symphonies number 2 and 3, symphonies of a length of more than 1 hour, sometimes performed faster, but this doesn't say it's right, because he himself had insisted that the pieces are about 1 hour or longer. And he never heard his third symphony. He only once heard his second symphony, and he only once heard his first symphony, which was just composed before Second World War began. So he's also from the second generation, like Ivanov in France, the Bulgarian disciple of Petr Dönov. He was in Nuremberg. He was not a disciple of Steiner. He was only a spiritual admirer, and he was living in Nuremberg. And he created the most fantastic music of the anthroposophic circles ever written. But it's not important for anybody listening to this music to understand that he had something to do with anthroposophy. It was just his Weltanschauung, his idea about the organic unity of the whole world, about the principles holding it together, and so on. And Scherber also composed 31 pieces on the alphabet. Actually, he wrote the I but forgot the J, but it's marked as the J, and people miss the I in the alphabet of his music. Because he didn't write these pieces all together. He wrote them some then, some now, and so on. And so finally they were collected, and they were also published, and we did a recording of it, which is not released now on Altila Records, with the phenomenal Italian pianist Ottavio Maria Maceratini. And it's absolutely beautiful music, and it's very interesting music because it is as well purely artistic music as it is for pedagogical use. It is a fantastic music if you work with young or also with progressed students. And then we have in the Gurdjieff movement, people stayed always with the same music, but the whole constellation was very particular. So Gurdjieff had among his pupils, he had in Moscow, he had one pupil who was Thomas de Hartmann, born in the 1880s, Ukrainian composer, pupil of Taneyev, actually, of one of the greatest Russian composers at all. and a real traditionalist. But Thomas de Hartmann's life is finally divided into three. He had written some music in a more almost avant-garde style before he met Gurdjieff. He even had aligned with some modern artists in Murnau in Bavaria, with painters and so on. Then he met Gurdjieff, and then he would, together with Gurdjieff, write these pieces, which are very simple music in a way. So many arrogant commentators, opinionists would call it a primitive and not interesting music. But for me, it was very interesting to discover when I worked on this music with musicians that it was particularly challenging because of the long melodic lines, which need an incredible breadth of phrasing, very simple harmonics, and very fine but very subtle rhythmical quality. And to make these pieces work, that means to make them work as a whole, it needs an incredible concentration of the musician because it's very pure music. And there is not very much opportunity to do some arbitrary expression. It makes no sense. And you can very easily destroy this music. His music for the movements, which was written for larger ensemble or even orchestra, and orchestrated very well by Thomas de Hartmann, it was released once on a Dutch label, which got a special okay for doing that, special permission, and it was played, I must say it was played in a very non-idiomatic way. It doesn't sound as it should sound. It doesn't groove at all. And so they did this pioneer work, and one can hear it, but one will not get an authentic impression from that. This is how it sometimes happens. And the fourth composer from this group, so Gurdjieff was not at all able to compose. Gurdjieff was just whistling, singing, tapping the rhythm and such things. And then Hartmann would put it together on the piano and orchestrate some of these things. Then we have the fourth one, who created these very successful rhythmical gymnastics, Emil Schechter-Gross. He was a real professional composer, and he would write, among other pieces, 2 violin concertos and string quartets, chamber music, orchestral music, and even music for the stage and so on. And he is a very fine composer who some people consider one of the best Swiss composers. And he is, many pieces are already recorded, some under the direction of Adriano, the Swiss conductor specializing in underrated music. And it is worth giving it a listen, and it is worth also recreating this music. And it is more, as you could say, in the normal way, composed in a normal way. So we have this Gurdjieff music, which is absolutely unique and very close to a kind of authentic Caucasian, Minor Asian, Turkish, and so on feeling. Then we have this music by Petr Dönov, which is totally in the Bulgarian folkloristic style, and which has been expanded to 4-part a cappella, which is absolutely beautiful, very pure, and very simple music in the best sense. Then we have the music of the Steiner peoples, which is totally different. There is no established style at all. And there are very different composers. There's even a lot of 12-tone things by people like Fritz Büchtger and so on. And also today, a lot of anthroposophic composers. One of the finest today is Torben Maywald, who lives near Hamburg, and who is a master in writing a kind of new simplicity style. Yes, and we have Jacques Dalcroze, who is one of the real composers. And we have some other composers which are very interesting, and maybe for me the most interesting. There is Gustav Holst, who was very interested in Indian music and who is fantastic music, not only the planets. There are a lot of pieces. Mystic Trumpeter, Benny Moore Suite, and so on. Choral symphonies. A real master and fantastic sound and totally his own world. And then we have John Fowles, who is one of the most underrated composers of the 20th century. Born in 1880 in Manchester, died in 1939 in Calcutta because he just got cholera. And he went to India only in the mid of the 1930s, became classical music director of All India Radio, met there Walter Kaufmann, another admirer of Indian music and later specialist in raga, teaching in Bloomington from Vienna, a Jew. And Fowles was a real genius. And the music of Fowles is a real effort to recreate all style Greek, all style Indian music, sometimes extremely complex and sometimes extremely simplistic. So John Fowles is also to be rediscovered, or to be discovered at all, we must say. And he, in the 1910s, when he had met Maud McCarthy, the woman who went with him through this life, he dedicated himself to studying Indian music because she had been to India and she had understood it. She was a pupil of Joseph Joachim, a fantastic violinist and an excellent singer. And they introduced Indian music together to the London public. And then they found they thought they had found a kind of home in theosophic circles, but very soon they understood that it doesn't work. And they distanced themselves again from that and searched for their own approach to spirituality and music. They had these states of clairaudience. That means the same thing as clairvoyance, clairaudience. They were sitting in two different rooms and received the same melodies. You may believe it or not. So John Fowles is absolutely fascinating phenomenon and should be mentioned together with these other people. We have also these recollections of ancient Greek music by John Fowles with pieces like Solemn Temple Dance and Processional, and this kind of music which tries to recreate in an authentic way a kind of old world hidden behind all the modern stuff of music. And Gurdjieff would speak about the need for so-called objective music. That means music that doesn't go lost in passion, in tragedy, in wild feelings, in all these things. So he would refuse all these things and would just search for a purity of spirit, for balance, and for all these things. And of course, therefore, there are also some ideas in the spiritual scene that this music always has to be in purity, in beauty, in balance, and so on. But what most of them don't understand is that best classical music has this quality on another level. That means, of course, it has contrasts, it has oppositions, it has dissonances, but it's an organic whole, unfolding from that and finding to a state that beginning is in the end is in the beginning, holding everything together and giving another challenge, of course, to the listener, but not confusing the listener. And of course, you can play the music in a way you confuse the listener or in a way you reaffirm the deepest root of the listener, but not his convictions, of course. these you have to leave aside. So this is what we normally here speak about, how classical music is a factor of bringing inner health. And with every kind of sound, with every kind of style. But we have this very specific corner of the music history where people were searching for a kind of obvious purity, simplicity, and holiness in music. And we have this very particular fact that 4 of these people were creating a kind of new physical movement tradition, which is still alive. So see you.